In a gleaming Los Angeles studio called the Grace Table, a calm, silver-haired martial artist sat beneath studio lights, waiting for the cue to go live. A simple conversation about faith and fame was about to ignite in front of millions. What began as a civil talk show turned volatile when a world-famous preacher publicly questioned another man's belief on live television. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical celebrity guest. For decades, he had served as an Air Force veteran turned martial arts champion, a man whose discipline had shaped both his body and his faith. Known for his stoic composure and legendary control, his quiet presence commanded more power than 1,000 sermons. When Bishop T.D. Jakes accused Norris of faking his faith, he had no idea he was walking into a storm of divine irony. As pride swelled and cameras rolled, Jakes's chair buckled beneath him, sending the televangelist sprawling in front of a stunned audience. Chuck didn't flinch. Instead, he rose and extended a steady hand, his calm response triggering a worldwide reckoning on humility and authenticity. What began as a televised debate became a revelation. The Grace Table studio would never be the same after the night. Faith itself seemed to intervene, and the man once called Hollywood's quiet warrior reminded the world that real strength doesn't shout, it stands still. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The golden light of Los Angeles evening streamed through the high windows of the Grace Table studio, casting long shadows across the polished stage. Crew members darted between cameras, adjusting lights and checking sound levels with practiced efficiency. The set, designed to evoke both spiritual warmth and prime-time glamour, gleamed under the studio lights. Two elegant chairs positioned at gentle angles, a table of burnished wood between them, and behind it all, a backdrop of soft blue that seemed to pulse with an almost heavenly glow. In the control booth overlooking the stage, Lisa Tran pressed her finger against her earpiece, dark eyes fixed on the bank of monitors before her. 30 minutes to air, she announced, her voice crisp with authority. I want camera 3 tight on Jakes when he gets going, and keep 5 on Norris, especially when he's not speaking. She leaned forward, scanning the readouts. We're trending already, people. This is going to be big. An assistant director raised his hand. If things get heated, should we prep for a commercial break? Lisa shook her head firmly. No cuts tonight. Whatever happens, we stay live. This isn't just another talk show. This is the collision of Hollywood and the pulpit. People want authenticity. Her lips curled into a small smile. And authenticity means messiness. Down in the green room, Chuck Norris sat quietly, one hand resting on his knee, the other holding a small, worn Bible. At 78, the legendary martial artist and actor carried his years with the same quiet dignity that had marked his career. His eyes, clear and focused, moved steadily across the page. Though he'd spent decades in the spotlight, there was something about Chuck that seemed untouched by fame, a centeredness that came not from Hollywood acclaim but from something deeper. A production assistant appeared at the door. Mr. Norris? Bishop Jakes has arrived. Chuck closed his Bible gently and rose. Thank you. Across the hall, Bishop T.D. Jakes was adjusting his tie, his imposing frame filling the mirror before him. Unlike Chuck's simple navy suit and open collar, Jakes wore tailored perfection. French cuffs gleaming with diamond cufflinks, a silk pocket square, shoes that caught the light with each turn. The lighting in the main studio, is it flattering? He asked the makeup artist hovering nearby. Very flattering, Bishop, she replied, dabbing powder across his forehead. They've adjusted everything, specifically for tonight. Jakes nodded, satisfied. At 67, he remained a commanding presence, the voice that had filled stadiums, counseled presidents, and built a multimedia empire based on spiritual guidance and motivational speaking. Yet recently, whispers had begun circulating about his increasingly lavish lifestyle, about sermons that felt more like performances. Critics called him the Hollywood pastor, suggesting he'd become more brand than believer. The whispers bothered him more than he cared to admit. The door opened, and Chuck Norris stepped in. For a moment, the two men regarded each other, fire and stillness, thunder and calm. "Bishop Jakes." Chuck extended his hand. "Good to finally meet you, Brother Norris." Jakes took his hand, his grip firm, his voice resonant and warm with the cadence that had made him famous. "Looking forward to our conversation." Something flickered across Jakes's eyes, a momentary assessment, perhaps recognition that the man before him was not what he had expected. The handshake lingered a beat too long. "They tell me we're discussing faith and fame tonight," Chuck said quietly. "Indeed," Jakes smiled. "Two worlds that don't always mix well. Yet here we both are," Chuck replied, his expression unreadable. In the main studio, Jordan Hale was reviewing his notes, his boyish features belying 15 years of network experience. At 42, he'd built the Grace Table into more than just another celebrity talk show. It was a place where meaningful conversations happened, where public figures revealed sides of themselves rarely seen. Tonight, though, he sensed something different in the air. Something electric. "Places everyone," called the floor director. "Audience is being seated." The studio doors opened, and the audience filtered in a cross-section of America. Church groups in their Sunday best sat alongside Hollywood executives in casual luxury. College students with theology textbooks found seats near skeptics drawn by Chuck Norris's star power. They filled the space with a buzz of anticipation, phones already positioned for the perfect social media shot. Eddie Cruz, senior cameraman for 12 years, adjusted his focus and checked his monitor. He'd filmed hundreds of episodes, but something about tonight felt significant. He zoomed in on the empty chairs, sensing they wouldn't remain peaceful for long. At 5 minutes to air, Jordan took his position at the side of the stage. Chuck and Jakes were led to their marks just off stage. "Remember," Lisa's voice came through to the floor team. "Tonight is about contrasts, the warrior and the wordsmith, the actor and the preacher. Let the tension build naturally." The lights dimmed. The audience quieted. The on-air sign glowed red. 3, 2, 1. The floor director pointed. Music swelled as Jordan strode onto the set, arms wide, smile bright. "Welcome to a very special edition of The Grace Table, where tonight we bring together two icons of faith from very different worlds." The cameras panned across the audience, capturing their eager faces. In one chair, a man whose words have moved millions, whose presence fills arenas, and whose message has transformed lives. Please welcome Bishop T.D. Jakes. The audience erupted as Jakes entered, waving to the crowd, his smile radiant. He moved with practiced confidence, shaking Jordan's hand warmly. "And in our other chair," Jordan continued, his voice dropping to a tone of reverence, "a legend of film and martial arts. A man whose quiet faith has guided a remarkable career, spanning decades, ladies and gentlemen, Chuck Norris." The applause that greeted Chuck was different respect rather than excitement. Admiration rather than adoration. He walked out simply, acknowledging the audience with a small nod, shaking hands with Jordan, then with Jakes once more before taking his seat. "Tonight," Jordan said, facing the camera directly, "we're talking about faith under the spotlight. How to remain authentic when the whole world is watching. Two men, two different paths, one shared belief." As the cameras shifted and the lights brightened, Chuck sat calm and still, his posture relaxed, yet dignified. Across from him, Jake settled into his chair with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Neither knew that within the hour, everything would change, that this carefully orchestrated discussion would transform into a moment that would be replayed millions of times across the globe, a moment where words and silence would collide with unexpected consequences. The broadcast had begun. "Let's start with something simple," Jordan said, leaning forward in his chair. "Faith and fame. Are they natural allies or natural enemies?" Jakes laughed, the sound warm and practiced. "Oh, they're oil and water, Jordan. Scripture tells us to be humble, but Hollywood asks us to promote ourselves. The spiritual life seeks quiet. Fame demands noise." His hands moved expressively, punctuating each point. "That's the daily tension for anyone trying to live authentically in the public eye." Jordan nodded, then turned. "Chuck, your thoughts?" Chuck's response came slowly, deliberately. "I think it depends on what you're famous for and how you carry it." His voice was softer than Jakes's booming tones, but carried a quiet authority. "I've never sought fame for itself. It came through work I believed in." "But surely," Jordan pressed, "there must be challenges to maintaining your faith when surrounded by Hollywood's temptations." Chuck smiled slightly. "The challenges are the same for everyone, just more visible for those of us in the public eye. Faith isn't about avoiding challenges. It's about facing them with consistency." In the control booth, Lisa leaned toward her assistant. "He's so understated compared to Jake's. Push in on camera 5, capture that contrast." Jakes shifted in his chair, straightening his already perfect tie. "But Brother Norris," he said, the word brother carrying a hint of patronization, "isn't there a danger in the, shall we say, commercialization of faith, especially in Hollywood, where everything becomes a brand?" Something subtle changed in the studio atmosphere. The audience sensed it, a shift from conversation to confrontation. "I can't speak for Hollywood as a whole," Chuck replied evenly. "I can only speak for myself." Of course," Jake said, his smile wide but his eyes calculating. "But you've built quite the image around your beliefs. The righteous fighter for Christ." He made quotation marks in the air. "Some might say it's been profitable." Jordan glanced quickly at Chuck, then at the production booth, sensing the conversation veering off his planned course. Chuck's expression remained unchanged. "My faith isn't an image, Bishop. It's the foundation of everything else." "As it should be," Jakes responded, voice rising with the practiced cadence of a sermon building. "But in my experience, and I've counseled many celebrities, it's easy for public figures to construct a faith that looks good on camera but lacks depth in private." The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. "Faith doesn't need to perform," Chuck said quietly. "It just lives." Jakes leaned forward, his charisma almost tangible. "Exactly my point. Yet so much of what we see is performance rather than practice. The question becomes, how much is authentic and how much is for show?" In the control room, Lisa gestured emphatically. "Stay on them both. This is getting good." Eddie Cruz, behind camera 5, adjusted his focus on Chuck's face. In 15 years of filming, he'd developed an instinct for authentic moments. Something about the stillness in Chuck's expression made Eddie's finger hover over the zoom. This wasn't just talk show tension. This was something deeper. "I believe," Chuck said, meeting Jakes' gaze directly, "that judgment of others' faith is dangerous territory. Only God truly knows a person's heart." The audience responded with scattered applause, but Jakes was already shaking his head. "With respect, Brother Norris, discernment isn't judgment. Paul himself warned against false teachers and those who use godliness as a means to financial gain. His voice rose further. In these times, we must distinguish between those who truly walk the walk and those who simply talk a good talk. Jordan attempted to redirect. That's an interesting point about authenticity. Let me be clearer, Jakes continued, speaking over the host. When I see faith used as a career strategy, when I see Bibles carried as accessories and prayers offered as publicity, I have to question the foundation. The camera caught Chuck's eyes. Not angry, not defensive, just watching Jakes with calm assessment. Would you say, Chuck asked quietly, that external displays necessarily indicate insincerity? Not necessarily, Jakes replied, the words stretching under his emphasis. But they certainly raise questions. Especially in your industry, Brother Norris. My industry. Hollywood, Jakes said, waving his hand dismissively. Where image is everything, and substance often optional. Jordan tried again. Perhaps we could discuss how each of you maintains authentic. The problem, Jakes pressed on, fully in his element now, is that audiences can't distinguish between the man and the marketing. They see Chuck Norris, the Christian action hero, and assume the faith is as choreographed as the fights. A murmur rippled through the audience. Some audience members glanced at each other, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. Others leaned forward, drawn to the building conflict. In the booth, Lisa's eyes widened. Is he actually attacking Chuck Norris? On faith? Keep the cameras rolling. This is ratings gold. On stage, Chuck's posture hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had deepened, not anger, but a kind of centered certainty. Bishop Jakes, he said calmly, you've built quite a public ministry yourself. Multiple books, movies, a megachurch with television broadcasts. By your standard, couldn't those same questions apply to your work? For a fleeting moment, Jakes seemed taken aback. Then his expression hardened slightly before dissolving into a practiced smile. The difference, Brother Norris, is consistency. My life's work has been the ministry, not pretending to be something I'm not for the cameras. I've never pretended, Chuck said simply. Perhaps not intentionally, Jakes replied, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality that had made his sermons famous. But Hollywood faith is like Hollywood marriage. It looks good on the red carpet, but often lacks foundation when the cameras stop rolling. Jordan looked directly at the control booth, silently pleading for guidance. This had moved beyond spirited discussion into personal territory. Lisa held up a hand to her concerned assistant. Don't cut away. This is exactly what we wanted: authenticity. Remember? On stage, the tension had become palpable. Chuck remained still, his breathing even, his gaze steady. Jakes, by contrast, seemed to expand with energy, his gestures more emphatic. The scripture tells us to test all things, Jakes continued, his voice resonant with authority. And I've seen too many celebrities use faith as a brand extension rather than a life commitment. Chuck looked at him directly. And you believe my faith falls into that category? The question hung in the air, direct, unavoidable. Jakes hesitated for just a moment, perhaps sensing he'd crossed a line. Then, with the confidence of a man accustomed to speaking hard truths, he leaned forward. I believe, Brother Norris, that Hollywood has learned to market faith just like it markets everything else. And your particular brand of Christianity, strong, silent, warrior for God, fits perfectly with your movies and your image. He spread his hands wide. Is it genuine? Perhaps parts of it. But is it crafted for public consumption? Almost certainly. The audience gasped collectively. Camera 5 captured Chuck's face in perfect clarity. Unmoving, unblinking, Unreadable. Jordan stepped in desperately. I think we're moving into very personal territory. Truth is always personal, Jordan, Jake said, his smile not reaching his eyes. And sometimes, a brother needs to hear difficult truths. He turned back to Chuck, his expression softening to something that looked like pastoral concern, but carried a hint of condescension. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tell me, Chuck, Jake said, the informality of the first name suddenly striking in contrast to the previous, Brother Norris. How much of your faith is real, and how much is just a brand? The audience fell completely silent. In the control booth, even Lisa held her breath. Chuck Norris sat perfectly still, his eyes never leaving Jake's face. The silence stretched for 1 second, then 2, then 3, an eternity in broadcast television. And in that moment of charged silence, something shifted in the studio atmosphere. A tension beyond words or cameras or lights, as if the air itself had become heavy with expectation. What happened next would be replayed millions of times around the world within hours. The silence that followed Jake's question seemed to expand beyond the bounds of time, stretching into uncomfortable territory even for prime-time television. Chuck's expression remained unchanged, his breathing steady, his eyes holding Jake's gaze with neither anger nor fear. In the control booth, Lisa pressed her finger to her earpiece. "Stay on, Chuck. Do not cut away," she whispered urgently. The audience had gone completely still. Phones were raised higher, capturing the moment. Sensing something unprecedented was unfolding, Jordan shifted in his chair, caught between professional obligation to keep the show moving and the unmistakable feeling that interrupting now would be a mistake. Finally, Chuck spoke. His voice soft but carrying to every corner of the studio. "Bishop Jakes," he said, "I've spent my life trying to follow Christ's example, not perfectly, but sincerely. I've never claimed to be anything more than a flawed man seeking to do better each day." Jakes nodded, the gesture somehow both gracious and dismissive. "Of course. And that humility is commendable. But surely you must recognize how your faith has become part of your public persona, your Chuck Norris brand, if you will." Several audience members exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the inspirational discussion of spiritual wisdom they had expected, but something more confrontational, more personal. "I don't see my faith as a brand," Chuck replied simply. "Don't you?" Jakes leaned forward, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality that had filled stadiums. The strong, silent Christian warrior, fighting for justice on screen and for the Lord off screen. It's a powerful image, marketable, profitable. His hands cut through the air for emphasis. But is it authentic? That's my question. Jordan attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we could discuss how both of you navigate the challenges of..." "My concern," Jakes continued, speaking over Jordan with practiced ease, "is for the millions watching who might mistake Hollywood Christianity for the genuine article." He turned to the audience directly. True faith isn't about image or appearance. It's about substance. The irony of this statement, coming from a man in a custom suit with diamond cufflinks, speaking with theatrical emphasis, seemed lost on Jakes himself. Eddie Cruz, behind camera 5, kept his focus tight on Chuck. In all his years of filming, he'd developed an instinct for authentic moments. And something in the quiet dignity of Chuck's posture made Eddie hold his breath. This wasn't acting. This was something else entirely. "Bishop," Chuck said, his voice still measured, "real faith doesn't crumble under judgment." The audience responded with murmurs of approval. Something in the simple statement seemed to cut through the theatrical tension Jakes had been building. Jakes' smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's absolutely correct, Brother Norris. which is precisely why we must examine what's real and what's manufactured. He spread his hands wide, addressing the audience directly. In a world of carefully crafted images and social media performances, we need discernment more than ever. The cameras caught Jakes in his element, now commanding the stage, his voice rising and falling with practiced precision, his gestures expansive. When I counsel young believers, I warn them about false prophets in designer clothing, about Hollywood spirituality that looks good in interviews but lacks depth in private. Jordan cast a desperate glance toward the control booth. This had gone far beyond the planned discussion. Lisa shook her head slightly. Her assistant director leaned in. "Should we cut to commercial?" "Absolutely not," Lisa whispered. "This is real. This is happening. Stay live." On stage, Jakes had built to full preaching rhythm. The scripture warns us about those who have a form of godliness, but deny its power, who use the language of faith for their own advancement. He turned directly to Chuck. "I don't doubt you believe in something, Brother Norris. But is it the gospel of Christ or the gospel of Chuck?" A collective gasp rose from the audience. Even Jordan's professional composure cracked as his eyebrows shot up in surprise. Throughout this escalation, Chuck had remained still. His breathing even, his posture, relaxed, yet dignified. Now he leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but clear. "Bishop Jakes," he said, "I've respected your ministry for many years, but I wonder if, in your passion to protect others from false faith, you've confused performance with sincerity." Jakes blinked, momentarily thrown off rhythm. "My movies are performances," Chuck continued. "My faith is not. One is my profession. The other is my life." A smattering of applause broke out from the audience, quickly hushed as people remained riveted to what was unfolding. Jakes recovered quickly, his charisma reasserting itself. "A beautiful sentiment, Brother Norris. Truly." His smile was broad, but didn't quite reach his eyes. "But it's precisely that kind of polished response that concerns me. Hollywood has taught you well how to deliver the perfect line at the perfect moment." He stood suddenly, a power move that commanded attention, his voice rising to fill the studio. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, friends," he addressed the audience directly now. Carefully crafted words that sound spiritual, but avoid the hard questions. "This is what I call Hollywood faith. Looks good. Sounds good. But when you reach for it." He made a grasping motion with his hand, then opened his fingers, as if letting sand slip through. "There's nothing of substance to hold on to." The lights seemed to flicker almost imperceptibly. A technician in the booth glanced at his controls with momentary confusion. Jakes didn't notice. He was fully in sermon mode now, his voice thundering with the cadence that had made him famous. "I stand before you tonight concerned about a culture where faith has become a commodity, packaged, marketed, and sold to the highest bidder." Chuck watched him calmly, making no move to stand, no attempt to match Jakes's volume or energy. "Let me be absolutely clear," Jakes continued, pointing now for emphasis, his voice building. "I'm calling out a system where faith becomes just another role to play, where Christianity becomes a costume to put on when the cameras are rolling and the fans are watching." The lights flickered again, more noticeably this time. A low rumble seemed to pass through the studio. Perhaps the subway passing beneath the building. Perhaps something else. Jakes either didn't notice or chose to incorporate it into his performance, his voice rising higher. "When I see faith reduced to a marketing strategy, when I see the gospel used to sell movies or books or merchandise, I have to speak truth to power." Eddie Cruz felt something strange through his camera, a subtle vibration, as if the floor itself were humming with energy. His years of experience made him tighten his focus on Chuck, somehow sensing that whatever happened next would be the defining moment of the broadcast. Jakes took another step forward, physically dominating the space now, his voice reaching full preacher intensity. So I'll say what needs to be said. Even if it's uncomfortable. Even if it costs me. Some faith, some Hollywood faith is nothing but a fabrication. A performance. A script written to appeal to Christian audiences. He turned fully toward Chuck now. His expression a mixture of righteous indignation and something harder to define. Perhaps insecurity. Perhaps pride. Brother Norris, he said, the formality of the address contrasting with the dismissiveness in his tone. I don't doubt your sincerity. I question the authenticity of faith that seems so perfectly aligned with your public image. Faith that never seems to wrestle, never seems to doubt, never seems to. He paused, searching for the right word. Never seems to require anything beyond what looks good on camera. Throughout this escalation, Chuck had not moved. His breathing remained calm, his eyes clear and focused. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet enough that the audience leaned forward to hear. Bishop, he said simply, I think you're confusing your own reflection for my reality. For a moment, Jake seemed genuinely startled, as if he'd expected any response except this one. Before he could recover, the lights flickered a third time. The rumble beneath the floor grew more pronounced. Several audience members glanced around nervously. Jakes regained his composure, drawing himself up to full height. His voice dropped to a dramatic near whisper that nevertheless carried to every corner of the room. I'll tell you what I see clearly, Chuck Norris. I see Hollywood. Made faith packaged and polished for public consumption, but lacking the fire and conviction of genuine belief. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Chuck's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in his eyes, not anger, not hurt, but a kind of knowing certainty, as if he were witnessing something he'd seen many times before. In that moment, as the cameras captured every nuance, as millions watched around the country, as the tension in the studio reached its breaking point, a change came over the room. The air itself seemed charged with anticipation, as if waiting for a response to Jakes's challenge. What came next was not what anyone expected. The studio lights flickered again, more insistently this time. A strange stillness fell over the audience, as the air seemed to grow heavy with an unseen energy. In the control booth, Lisa Tran leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at the monitor. What's happening with the electrics? She demanded, pressing her finger against her earpiece. Everything's normal according to the board, her assistant replied, confusion evident in his voice. Main power is stable. Backup generators aren't engaged. It's just the lights. Lisa frowned, her producer's instincts sensing something unusual unfolding. Check the building systems. Is there construction work nearby? Subway activity? The technical director shook his head, scanning his readouts. Nothing scheduled. And the subway wouldn't affect just the stage lights like this. On stage, oblivious to these technical concerns, Bishop Jakes continued his sermon, like address. His confidence seemingly growing with each passing moment. He paced across the stage with practiced showmanship, his voice rising and falling in the rhythmic cadence that had filled stadiums and arenas throughout his career. We live in an age of deception, he proclaimed, gesturing dramatically, where appearances mask reality, where celebrity substitutes for character, where performance replaces authenticity. The rumble beneath the studio floor intensified slightly, perhaps the subway passing below, perhaps something else entirely. A few audience members exchanged nervous glances. One older woman in the front row clutched her purse more tightly to her chest, her eyes darting toward the exit signs. A younger man, 2 rows back, pulled out his phone, beginning to record what was happening, sensing something noteworthy was unfolding. Chuck remained seated, perfectly composed, his breathing even, his gaze steady. The camera caught the subtle details of his posture, shoulders relaxed, hands resting calmly on his knees, no tension in his jawline or around his eyes. The contrast between his stillness and Jake's theatrical energy couldn't have been more pronounced. Eddie Cruz, focusing camera 5 on Chuck, felt a strange certainty growing within him. In 15 years behind the camera, he had developed an almost supernatural instinct for genuine moments, those rare instances when reality broke through the carefully constructed facade of television. Something about Chuck's unwavering calm amid the building tension made Eddie adjust his focus, tightening the frame slightly. This was the shot that mattered. "Let me speak plainly," Jakes continued, turning to face the audience directly, his back momentarily to Chuck. His voice had taken on the passionate intensity that had made him famous, part sermon, part performance, compelling and dramatic. When I see faith used as a career strategy, when I see the gospel reduced to a marketing tactic, I cannot remain silent. In the front row, a woman nodded vigorously, raising her hand in agreement. Beside her, a man remained still, his expression thoughtful rather than convinced. The audience itself seemed divided, some drawn into Jakes' rhetoric, others increasingly uncomfortable with the personal direction of his comments. Jake spun back toward Chuck, his expression fierce with conviction. "The scripture warns us about those who maintain an appearance of godliness while denying its power. Those who use holy words for worldly gain. Those who—" A sharp crack interrupted him loud enough to make several audience members gasp. It came from somewhere above the stage, a sound like stressed metal giving way. In the control booth, Lisa jerked upright. What was that? Her assistant was already on the phone to building maintenance, his voice urgent but hushed. "Something's happening with the stage rigging." "Should we cut the broadcast?" asked the director, finger hovering over the button that would take them to commercial. Lisa hesitated, caught between professional responsibility and producer's instinct. After a split second that felt much longer, she shook her head. "Stay with it. Whatever's happening, stay with it." On stage, Jakes hesitated for a split second, glancing upward, then recovered quickly. Professional speakers develop an ability to incorporate distractions into their message, and Jakes was among the best. Those who speak of faith but show none of its. Another crack, louder this time, followed by a strange groaning sound from the studio ceiling. One of the large lighting fixtures above the stage swayed slightly, its cables visibly straining. A technician in the wings looked up, alarmed, and made a cutting motion across his throat, the universal signal to end the broadcast immediately. Jordan half rose from his chair, concern evident in his expression. "Perhaps we should—" "No." Jakes raised his hand, commanding attention once more. "This is too important to interrupt. I'm speaking truth that needs to be heard." Something in his tone had changed, a note of defensiveness perhaps, or a sense that he needed to finish what he'd started before losing momentum. His usual perfect timing seemed slightly off, as if he sensed his moment slipping away and was determined to reclaim it. In the control booth, Lisa was on her feet. "What's happening up there? Get someone to check those lights now." She turned to her assistant. "Should we evacuate?" The building manager's voice came through her earpiece, tense but controlled. "We're checking the systems, no immediate danger signals, but something's definitely wrong with the stage area specifically." "Specifically?" Lisa repeated, her producer's mind racing. "Just the stage area? Nothing else in the building?" "Correct. It's isolated. Localized. Engineering can't explain it." Lisa's eyes widened slightly as she looked back at the monitors. watching Jake's continue his impassioned speech, watching Chuck's unwavering calm, watching the strange energy building in the studio. For a moment, just a moment, a thought crossed her mind that had nothing to do with ratings or production values or broadcast safety. A thought that felt both irrational and undeniable. What if this is something else entirely? On stage, either not hearing this commotion or choosing to power through it, Jakes took another step closer to Chuck. His voice lowered to a dramatic near whisper that nonetheless carried throughout the studio. "I say this not in judgment, but in love," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Your faith, Chuck Norris, your Hollywood faith, lacks the fire of genuine conviction. It's a script written for audience approval, not a life transformed by grace." The moment the words left his mouth, something extraordinary happened. A loud pop echoed through the studio as the chair beneath Jake's suddenly shifted. Whether from a mechanical failure, the vibrations rumbling through the floor, or something less explainable, the hydraulic mechanism that controlled the chair's height gave way with a hiss of escaping air. The sound was so distinct, so precisely timed after Jakes's accusation, that it seemed almost choreographed. Several audience members later reported that they initially thought it was part of the show. A dramatic sound effect, coordinated with Jakes's statement for emphasis. Jakes's eyes widened in surprise as his seat dropped several inches without warning. He grabbed for the desk instinctively, but his momentum was already carrying him backward. His microphone slipped from his grasp, hitting the floor with a burst of feedback that pierced through the studio like a physical presence. Time seemed to slow in that moment, as it often does during unexpected events. Eddie Cruz, still focused on Chuck, caught a subtle change in the man's expression. Not satisfaction or vindication, but a flicker of what looked almost like recognition, as if witnessing the unfolding of something he had seen before in different forms. Jordan froze, halfway out of his chair, caught between professional responsibility to salvage the broadcast and genuine concern for what was happening. The audience collectively held its breath, the studio suddenly so silent that the continued hiss of air escaping from Jakes's chair mechanism seemed unnaturally loud. For one surreal moment, Bishop T.D. Jakes, the commanding, confident voice of spiritual authority to millions, was captured by every camera in the studio as he flailed, off balance, dignity deserting him as gravity took control. His carefully tailored suit, his perfect positioning, his commanding presence all undone in an instant by a simple mechanical failure that could not have been more perfectly timed. The stage lights flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows across the scene like punctuation marks in a visual sentence being written before their eyes. The cameras caught every detail. Jakes's expression shifting from surprise to alarm, his hands grasping at empty air, the polished veneer of control cracking to reveal simple human vulnerability beneath. The audience gasped collectively as Jakes's chair tipped backward. He reached out, trying to steady himself, but it was too late. With a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence of the studio, one of America's most prominent pastors tumbled from his seat and landed in an ungraceful heap on the studio floor. His wireless microphone, still active, captured his undignified grunt of surprise for all of America to hear. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. The studio hung suspended in shocked disbelief. Jordan seemed frozen in his chair, mouth slightly open. The audience sat motionless, as if witnessing something they couldn't quite comprehend, something that transcended the usual boundaries of entertainment and entered the realm of the inexplicable. Only Chuck Norris moved, rising calmly from his seat, concern rather than satisfaction in his eyes. The motion was fluid, unhurried, the natural response of a man accustomed to responding to unexpected situations with measured control rather than reactive emotion. In the control booth, Lisa stood transfixed, her hand pressed against her mouth. The monitors before her displayed multiple angles of the scene. Jake's on the floor, Chuck rising to help, Jordan frozen in place. The audience caught in suspended animation. For a moment, her professional detachment faltered. This wasn't just unexpected television. This was something that felt almost ordained. "Stay with it," she whispered urgently. "Every camera. Don't cut away. Don't miss a single moment." Her assistant leaned closer. "Should we go to commercial? Give him time to recover?" Lisa shook her head, her eyes never leaving the monitors. "No. This is the moment. The real moment. Stay live." Eddie Cruz kept his focus locked on Chuck, instinctively understanding that this moment, this contrast, would be the image everyone remembered. The fallen preacher and the steady warrior. Pride collapsed, and humility standing firm. The visual metaphor was so perfect, so cinematically precise, that it felt almost scripted. Except, no script could have created the raw authenticity captured in Chuck's eyes, or the genuine shock visible in Jake's expression. A young woman in the second row of the audience made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a gasp, but something in between. An older man near the back whispered something to his wife, who nodded slowly, eyes wide. A teenage girl raised her phone higher, capturing the moment, somehow understanding that she was witnessing something that would be discussed long after tonight's broadcast ended. The silence broke as several production assistants rushed onto the stage. Jordan finally found his voice. "Are you all right, Bishop?" Jake sat up slowly, his immaculate suit now rumpled, his carefully maintained composure shattered. For a moment, genuine confusion and embarrassment flashed across his face. Emotions rarely seen from a man who had built a career on projecting unwavering confidence. There was something almost childlike in his expression, the look of someone whose certainties had been suddenly and unexpectedly challenged. Yes, I'm fine," he said, his voice stripped of its theatrical power. Suddenly, just a man picking himself up from an unexpected fall. The change in his tone was striking, the practiced cadence gone, replaced by simple, unadorned speech. Chuck stepped forward, extending his hand without hesitation. "Let me help you up, Bishop." The gesture was simple, genuine, offered without irony or triumph. Chuck's expression showed only concern, his movements unhurried and deliberate. There was no hint of satisfaction in his face, no subtle indication that he saw poetic justice in what had happened. Only the natural human response to another person in difficulty. Jakes looked up at the outstretched hand, then at Chuck's face. Something passed between them in that moment. A recognition, perhaps, or a realization. With visible reluctance that quickly transformed into gratitude, he reached up and took the offered help. As Chuck steadied him, helping him back to his feet with the same strength and control that had marked his film career, Jake seemed momentarily at a loss for words, a rare state for one of America's most eloquent speakers. His usual arsenal of phrases and flourishes had deserted him, leaving only unvarnished reality. "Thank you," he said quietly, the words barely picked up by the microphones. Chuck nodded once, still holding Jake's arm to ensure he was stable. "Sometimes," he said softly, "faith reminds us who's in charge." The words weren't triumphant or accusatory, just a simple observation offered without judgment. Yet something in their gentle delivery, in the timing of the moment, in the stark visual contrast between what had just happened and what had just been said, struck a chord that resonated through the studio. A single person in the audience began to applaud. Not the wild, enthusiastic clapping of entertainment, but the measured, thoughtful acknowledgement of something profound. Others joined, the applause spreading like ripples in still water, building not to a frenzy, but to a sustained expression of recognition. In the control booth, Lisa watched the applause spread, understanding that what they were capturing now had transcended the boundaries of mere television. This wasn't about ratings anymore, or controversy, or even the specific topic of discussion. This had become something else, a moment of unexpected truth, a visual parable unfolding in real time. "We're trending everywhere," her assistant whispered, checking the social media feeds. "Clips are already going viral. Number Faith Falls is the top hashtag nationwide." Lisa barely heard him. She was focused on the monitors, on the image of Chuck helping Jakes, on the genuine transformation visible in both men's expressions. In 15 years of producing television designed to provoke reactions, she had inadvertently captured something that created genuine reflection instead. "Don't touch anything," she said quietly. "Just let it happen." On stage, Jakes looked out at the audience, then back at Chuck, who had returned to his seat with the same quiet dignity with which he'd risen. For perhaps the first time in decades of public speaking, Bishop T.D. Jakes seemed genuinely humbled, not by words or arguments or theological debate, but by an unexpected moment of human vulnerability contrasted against unflinching compassion. The studio lights stabilized, no longer flickering. The strange rumbling beneath the floor subsided. The technical anomalies that had preceded the moment passed as unexplainably as they had arrived, leaving behind only their effects: a changed atmosphere, a transformed conversation, and millions of witnesses to what had unfolded. Jordan, sensing the shift in energy, leaned forward. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "this is a moment to reflect on what true strength looks like in faith and in character." Jakes nodded slowly, his eyes meeting Chuck's across the space between them. The silence that followed wasn't empty or awkward, but full of unspoken understanding, a moment of genuine connection that no script could have created. What had begun as confrontation had transformed, in one unexpected instant, into something far more powerful. A visible parable about pride and humility, about words and actions, about appearance and substance, played out live before millions of watching eyes. And at the center of it all sat Chuck Norris, as steady and unshaken as he had been from the first moment of the broadcast, embodying without words the very faith that Jakes had questioned. The world was watching. And in the strange silence that followed, everyone somehow knew that what they had just witnessed would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. The studio remained wrapped in a hushed reverence, as if the audience collectively understood they were witnessing something beyond ordinary television. The applause had faded, leaving behind a silence rich with meaning, not uncomfortable, but contemplative. The air itself seemed charged with a peculiar energy, like the stillness after lightning strikes but before thunder follows. Bishop Jakes settled back into his chair, which production assistants had quickly stabilized. A technician knelt beside it, making subtle adjustments to the hydraulic mechanism, his movements careful and precise. The man whispered something to Jakes, words the microphones didn't catch, and Jakes nodded, a flicker of confusion still visible in his eyes. The technician shook his head slightly, clearly unable to explain what had just happened. Jakes's physical composure had returned, his posture once again upright, his hands steady as they rested on the arms of the chair. But something fundamental had changed in his demeanor. The theatrical confidence that had defined his presence earlier in the broadcast had been replaced by a quieter, more authentic presence. His eyes, when they met Chuck's, carried a mixture of embarrassment, respect, and dawning recognition. "I believe," he said finally, his voice notably softer than before, "we were discussing authenticity." A ripple of gentle laughter passed through the audience, not mocking, but appreciative of the moment's perfect irony. Several people nodded, recognizing the elegant simplicity of his acknowledgement. Chuck nodded slightly, his expression neither triumphant nor judgmental. We were in the control booth. Lisa watched the monitors intently, hardly daring to breathe. She had pursued conflict for ratings, hoping to capture a clash between spiritual titans. Instead, she had documented something far more rare and valuable, a genuine moment of human transformation. Her assistant leaned toward her, about to speak, but she raised a hand, silently commanding focus. She knew instinctively that what followed next would be as important as what had just occurred. Jordan, sensing the opportunity to redirect the conversation toward healing rather than confrontation, leaned forward. His professional instincts, honed through years of guiding difficult discussions, recognized the delicate transition taking place. Perhaps this unexpected moment offers us a chance to reflect on how our faith responds to surprise and vulnerability. He said it gently, offering Jakes a dignified path forward rather than dwelling on the embarrassment of his fall. The audience seemed to collectively exhale, appreciating the graceful pivot. Jakes took a deep breath, straightening his shoulders. His hands moved to adjust his tie, a habitual gesture that had earlier seemed calculated for effect, but now appeared simply human. For a moment, he seemed to consider his options, perhaps weighing the professional path of moving quickly past the incident against something more challenging but authentic. When he spoke, his voice had lost its performative cadence, becoming more personal, more genuine than at any previous point in the broadcast. "You know," he said, looking not at the cameras but directly at Chuck, "in all my years of preaching, I've spoken often about how pride goes before a fall." A self-deprecating smile touched his lips. "I just never expected such a literal demonstration of the principle." The audience responded with warm laughter and scattered applause, appreciating his ability to find humor in his own humbling. A woman in the front row nodded approvingly, while a middle-aged man 2 rows behind her whispered something to his neighbor, both smiling with what looked like respect. Eddie Cruz, still focused on Chuck, captured the subtle softening in the man's expression, a gentle appreciation of Jakes's candor, without any hint of superiority. The camera lingered on Chuck's eyes, revealing a depth of compassion that transcended the superficial conflict that had dominated the earlier discussion. "Chuck," Jakes continued, using the first name now, with respect, rather than condescension. "I owe you an apology. My words earlier were presumptuous, perhaps even arrogant." The admission hung in the air, powerful in its simplicity, remarkable from a man not known for public contrition. Several audience members exchanged glances, recognizing the rarity of the moment. A younger woman near the front dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, unexpectedly moved. Chuck's response was equally straightforward. "Apology accepted, Bishop." In those 3 words, spoken without hesitation or qualification, Chuck embodied the very forgiveness at the heart of the faith they both claimed. No conditions, no lingering resentment, no requirement for further explanation or justification, just simple acceptance of the apology offered. The camera caught a close-up of Jakes's face as he registered Chuck's response. Something in his expression shifted, a subtle, relaxing around the eyes, a softening of the mouth, as if a burden had been lifted. For a man accustomed to commanding attention through powerful rhetoric, this quiet exchange seemed to affect him more deeply than any thunderous applause. Jordan watched them both, sensing the authentic connection forming where conflict had been moments before. His role as moderator had become almost unnecessary as the 2 men found their way toward genuine dialogue. "Would you mind sharing, Bishop Jakes, what's going through your mind right now?" It was a question designed to invite reflection rather than performance. and Jake seemed to recognize the difference. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then out at the studio audience, his gaze moving slowly across their faces, as if truly seeing them as individuals rather than a collective entity to be influenced. Then finally, he looked back at Chuck. When he spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability rarely heard in his public addresses. "I'm thinking about how easy it is to confuse volume for substance, how we can mistake our platforms for our purpose." He shook his head slowly, "and how sometimes God uses the most unexpected moments to remind us of what matters." A murmur of agreement passed through the audience. Several people nodded, some closing their eyes briefly as if reflecting on their own experiences of humbling moments. In the third row, an older gentleman with silver hair leaned toward his wife and whispered, "I've watched him preach for 20 years. Never heard him like this before." She squeezed his hand in silent acknowledgement. Eddie Cruz, behind camera 5, kept his focus tight on both men, sensing that what was unfolding now was perhaps more powerful than the dramatic fall itself, genuine reconciliation happening in real time, unscripted and unplanned. In 15 years of filming, he had captured countless moments of manufactured emotion, of carefully scripted reality. This was different. This was real. "Chuck," Jakes continued, leaning slightly forward in his chair, "you've responded to my challenging words with a grace I'm not sure I would have shown in your position. That speaks more about your faith than anything I was attempting to question." The audience murmured approval, many nodding in agreement. A young woman in the back raised her phone to capture the moment, then thought better of it and lowered it again, choosing to be present rather than document. In the control booth, Lisa stood transfixed, watching the monitors with an expression of wonder. In 15 years of producing television, she had chased ratings through conflict, controversy, and confrontation. She had built her career on manipulating emotions and manufacturing moments. Yet here, in this unexpected moment of humility and grace, she was witnessing something that transcended mere entertainment. Her assistant touched her arm. "Social media is exploding. This is already the most watched segment in the show's history." Lisa barely registered the words. For once, metrics and viewership numbers seemed secondary to what was actually unfolding on her screens. "Don't cut away," she whispered to her team. "This is sacred ground." On stage, Chuck leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. His movements remained measured, his presence centered and calm, the same quiet strength that had defined him throughout the broadcast. "Bishop Jakes, I've respected your ministry for many years. Your words reach people mine never could. Your passion inspires millions." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. The audience waited, collective breath held, sensing the significance of the moment. "But I've learned that strength isn't always about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes it's about being the stillest presence in the storm." The simplicity of the statement, delivered without pretension or theatrical flourish, resonated through the studio. Several audience members nodded, some wiping away unexpected tears. A man in clerical collar seated near the middle closed his eyes briefly, as if in silent prayer. A teenage girl who had been texting throughout much of the earlier discussion set her phone down on her lap, her full attention captured by the authenticity of the exchange. Jakes smiled a genuine smile now, without the polished, performative quality of earlier. "I've spent decades teaching others about humility while perhaps losing sight of it myself." He gestured to the chair that had so dramatically failed him. "Sometimes the lesson comes in unexpected ways." Chuck nodded. "God often speaks in whispers, not thunder. And sometimes," Jakes added with a self-deprecating chuckle, "through faulty hydraulics." The audience laughed warmly, the tension of earlier completely dissolved. The sound was different now, not the nervous laughter of discomfort or the obligatory response to a celebrity's joke, but the genuine appreciation of shared humanity. Something new had formed in the wake of conflict, a connection between two men from different worlds who had found common ground in an unexpected moment of vulnerability and grace. In the front row, a woman leaned toward her husband. "I came expecting a show," she whispered. "I didn't expect to be moved like this." Near the back, a young man who had been filming on his phone throughout the broadcast slowly lowered it, choosing to experience the moment directly rather than through a screen. Beside him, an older gentleman nodded approvingly at the choice. Jordan, sensing the natural conclusion of this profound exchange, glanced toward the control booth. Lisa nodded almost imperceptibly, acknowledging that they should honor the moment rather than push for more conflict or controversy. "We'll take a brief break," Jordan said, turning toward the camera, "and return for our final segment with Chuck Norris and Bishop T.D. Jake's, a conversation that has become about much more than we anticipated." As the on-air light dimmed for the commercial break, Jakes rose from his chair and extended his hand to Chuck. This time, the handshake wasn't performative or perfunctory, but genuine, a gesture of respect between equals. Chuck stood as well, accepting the handshake with quiet dignity. His expression remained calm, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there earlier. A recognition of something authentic emerging from what had begun as conflict. "They'll remember the fall?" Jake said quietly, aware that their microphones were off but the studio audience could still hear them. "But I hope they remember what came after, even more." Chuck nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not about how many times we fall, Bishop. It's about how we rise afterward." Jakes held Chuck's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly, understanding passing between them beyond the need for further words. In that silent exchange was a recognition of shared humanity. Not celebrity pastor and action star. Not theological opponents. But simply two men walking the same path from different starting points. In the audience, phones had been momentarily forgotten. The compulsive documentation that defines modern life had been temporarily suspended. No one was texting, or posting, or tweeting. They were simply present, witnesses to something that felt more significant than just another television moment, a living parable about pride, humility, and the quiet strength of genuine faith. An older woman dabbed at tears with a handkerchief, while beside her, a teenage granddaughter sat unusually still, absorbing the moment with unexpected attentiveness. A middle-aged man who had arrived skeptical about televised faith discussions found himself reconsidering assumptions he hadn't even realized he held. As the commercial break continued, several audience members turned to each other, speaking in hushed tones. Their expressions varied, some thoughtful, some moved, some confused, but all engaged in a way that transcended mere entertainment. Something transformative had happened in the space between performance and authenticity, between words proclaimed and truth embodied. In the control booth, Lisa watched the stage through the window, her expression thoughtful. In her relentless pursuit of ratings, she had pushed for conflict, hoping for a viral clash between spiritual titans. What she'd captured instead was something far more valuable, a moment of authentic transformation, witnessed by millions. Her assistant approached with a tablet, displaying real-time social media reactions. The numbers were impressive, but it was the quality of the responses that caught Lisa's attention. People weren't just reacting with emojis or memes, they were sharing genuine reflections, engaging in thoughtful discussions about pride, humility, and authentic faith. "We've never seen engagement like this," her assistant said, scrolling through the comments. "People are actually talking about substance, not just spectacle." Lisa nodded slowly, a subtle shift occurring in her own perspective. For years, she had operated under the assumption that controversy generated viewership, That conflict was the currency of successful television. Now she wondered if perhaps authenticity, real, unmanufactured truth might be the more valuable commodity. As the stage manager signaled 1 minute until they returned from commercial, Jordan approached both men. "That was remarkable," he said quietly. "How would you like to proceed when we return?" Jakes and Chuck exchanged a glance, some unspoken understanding passing between them. "Perhaps," Chuck suggested, "we could talk about what real strength looks like in faith and in life." Jakes nodded, smiling slightly. "I think I just learned something important about that very subject." Jordan looked from one man to the other, sensing that something had changed not just in the tone of the conversation but in the men themselves. The performative aspects of television had fallen away, revealing something more genuine beneath. The stage lights brightened, the on-air sign glowed red once more, and the cameras focused on 3 men who had entered this broadcast as personalities, but would leave it as something more complex and genuine fellow travelers on a spiritual journey that had taken an unexpected but profound turn. What had begun as entertainment had somehow transformed into enlightenment, not through careful scripting or production planning, but through the unexpected workings of timing, humility, and grace. And as the broadcast resumed, something in the quality of the silence told everyone present that what they were witnessing would resonate far beyond the confines of a television studio or the limitations of a ratings-driven hour. Some lessons don't need to be taught. They simply reveal themselves when the moment is right. By midnight, the moment had gone viral. T.D. Jakes falls after questioning Chuck Norris's faith read the headlines, spreading across social media platforms with the speed only reserved for truly unexpected cultural moments. Clips of the incident proliferated across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, each with its own hashtags. Number, the fall of pride. Number, Chuck and humility. Number, grace table. And perhaps most popular, number, God has a timing. News outlets across the political spectrum found different angles to emphasize, some focusing on the spectacle of Jakes's fall, others on Chuck's calm response, still others on the reconciliation that followed. Religious publications devoted lengthy analyses to the theological implications. Psychology blogs discussed the visual power of the moment as an illustration of hubris and humility. Even those typically cynical about televised spirituality found themselves drawn to the raw authenticity that had broken through the polished surface of primetime television. In a quiet home in the suburbs of Dallas, Chuck Norris sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling before him. His phone had been vibrating consistently for the past 3 hours, with messages from friends, family, and media outlets seeking comments or interviews. He had responded to none of them. Instead, he had chosen silence, the same centering stillness that had defined his response on the broadcast. His wife watched him from across the table, a small smile on her face. After 40 years of marriage, she recognized the thoughtful quality of his silence. "You're trending worldwide," she said, scrolling through her phone. "People are calling it a divine moment." Chuck looked up, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't about me." "I know," she replied softly. "That's exactly why it mattered." She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. They sat in comfortable silence, 2 people who had weathered fame's peculiar challenges together, understanding that this moment would pass like all others, but perhaps leaving something valuable in its wake. In his expansive home office in Atlanta, Bishop T.D. Jakes sat alone, watching the replay of the broadcast for the 3rd time. The room around him reflected his success awards, lined custom-built shelves, photographs with presidents and celebrities adorned the walls, leather-bound books filled mahogany bookcases. But his attention remained fixed on the screen before him. on the moment that had stripped away all those external markers of achievement. He winced slightly as he watched himself fall, but kept his eyes on the screen as the moment of reconciliation unfolded afterward. Something in his expression had softened with each viewing, the initial embarrassment giving way to reflection, and finally, to something approaching gratitude. His media team had prepared a statement carefully crafted, spiritually sound, media-friendly, but he had set it aside after reading its polished paragraphs. It was well written, but lacked the very thing the broadcast moment had revealed: unvarnished authenticity. Instead, he opened his laptop and began typing something new, something more personal. The words came slowly at first, then with increasing certainty. Tonight, I experienced a humbling reminder that our platform is not our purpose, and our position is not our power. What began as a theological discussion became, for me, a personal lesson in pride and grace. To Chuck Norris, I extend my deepest gratitude for showing me more about genuine faith through his actions than I managed to convey through all my words. To those who have followed my ministry, I offer this reflection. God often speaks most clearly in the moments we least expect, sometimes using methods we could never anticipate. True strength isn't about never falling, it's about how we rise and who helps us up when we do. He continued writing late into the night, crafting not a press release but a personal testimony, one that would later become one of the most shared and discussed reflections of his entire career. Pastors would quote it in sermons. Seminary professors would assign it in classes on practical theology, and countless individuals would find in it a mirror for their own struggles with pride and authenticity. In the quiet apartment she shared with 2 roommates in Los Angeles, Lisa Tran sat cross-legged on her couch, her laptop balanced on her knees. The network executives had been calling non-stop, alternating between ecstatic congratulations on the ratings and concerned questions about whether the chair malfunction could result in liability issues. But Lisa was focused on something else entirely. She was reviewing the raw footage, studying the moment not as a producer hunting for ratings, but as a witness to something that felt somehow sacred. When her phone rang again, she glanced at the screen, another network executive, and silently declined the call. Instead, she opened her email and began composing a message to her team. What we captured tonight wasn't just good television. It was something true. In our pursuit of conflict and controversy, we accidentally stumbled into authenticity. I've spent 15 years producing shows designed to generate reactions. Tonight, for perhaps the first time, I was part of something that created genuine reflection. She paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard, realizing that something had shifted in her own professional outlook. The metrics of success she had pursued so relentlessly, ratings, social media engagement, viral moments, suddenly seemed hollow compared to the impact of genuine human connection. She continued writing, outlining a new vision for the Grace Table, one that prioritized authentic dialogue over manufactured conflict, depth over spectacle. It was professionally risky, perhaps even naive in the cutthroat world of television production. But something about witnessing Chuck's quiet strength and Jake's humble transformation had awakened a dormant idealism in her approach to her work. Across America, the conversation continued beyond the expected news cycle. On late-night talk shows, hosts incorporated the moment into their monologues, some with gentle humor, others with surprising thoughtfulness. On social media, the clip was being shared not just as a viral moment of celebrity embarrassment, but as something deeper, a visual parable that seemed to transcend religious boundaries. In countless homes, the discussion moved beyond the spectacle to its meaning. Parents used it to talk with children about pride and humility. Pastors and spiritual leaders across denominations found in it a perfect illustration of grace under pressure. Even those normally cynical about televised spirituality found something compelling in the unscripted authenticity of what had unfolded. A psychology professor at Stanford incorporated the clip into a lecture on nonverbal communication, noting how Chuck's calm presence communicated more than Jake's eloquent words. A film school in New York analyzed the cinematography of the moment, particularly Eddie Cruz's instinctive focus on the contrast between the two men. A seminary in Chicago devoted an entire symposium to the theology of public humbling, with the broadcast as its central case study. Eddie Cruz, the cameraman who had captured the defining images of the moment, sat in a late-night diner with several members of the production crew. They had gathered after the broadcast, drawn together by the sense they had witnessed something significant. 15 years behind the camera, Eddie said, stirring his coffee. And that's the first time I've filmed something that felt, I don't know, bigger than the show. The others nodded in understanding. Did you see the frame when Norris helped Jake's up? Asked one of the audio technicians. That's going to be an image people remember. Eddie nodded. What struck me was that Chuck never changed. From the moment he walked on stage to the moment he left, same calm, same dignity, same presence. While everything else was chaos, he was steady. That's what made it powerful, said another crew member. It wasn't just that Jake's fell right after calling Chuck's faith fake. It was the contrast between them, in that moment, one man talking about strength, the other man showing it. The following Sunday morning, church attendance spiked noticeably across the country. Pastors found their congregations particularly attentive when the topics of pride, humility, and authentic faith arose. Social media feeds that normally featured political arguments and celebrity gossip were filled instead with reflections on spiritual authenticity and the nature of true strength. 2 weeks after the broadcast, Jordan Hale opened a special follow-up episode of The Grace Table with a thoughtful introduction. What makes a moment resonate beyond entertainment into meaning? Why do certain images stay with us, changing not just what we watch but how we see? 2 weeks ago, on this very stage, something unexpected happened. A discussion became a demonstration. Words transformed into witness. Since then, millions have watched, commented, and reflected on what that moment revealed about faith, humility, and authentic strength. Tonight, we explore not just what happened, but why it mattered so deeply to so many. The episode featured theologians, cultural commentators, and everyday viewers reflecting on why the moment had struck such a chord. Notably absent were both Chuck Norris, who had declined all interview requests, and Bishop T.D. Jakes, who had stepped back from public appearances for a period of personal reflection. 1 month after the broadcast, 2 significant things happened on the same day. First, Bishop T.D. Jakes returned to his pulpit at the Potter's House, delivering a sermon titled The Grace of Falling, that departed dramatically from his usual rhetorical style. Gone were the theatrical flourishes and booming declarations. In their place was something quieter, more reflective, more authentic. He stood behind the pulpit not as a towering figure of spiritual authority, but as a fellow traveler on a spiritual journey, sharing insights gleaned through unexpected humbling. For years, he told his congregation, I confused volume for power and platform for purpose. I mistook my gift for speaking about faith with the deeper gift of living it. He paused, looking out at the thousands who had gathered. Sometimes God uses our most public moments to teach our most personal lessons. The congregation responded with a standing ovation, not for his performance, but for his transformation. Many wiped away tears, moved by the vulnerability of a man they had long admired for his strength. That same evening, a package arrived at Chuck Norris's home. Inside was a handcrafted wooden box containing a simple note and a gift. The note, handwritten on heavy stationery, read. Chuck. In the years I've spent teaching about strength, I somehow missed its quieter manifestations. Thank you for the lesson I didn't know I needed. This belonged to my grandfather, a humble man of genuine faith. I believe he would approve of it. Finding a home with you. With respect and gratitude. T.D. Jakes. The gift was a worn leather Bible, its pages marked with decades of study, its margins filled with handwritten notes, a family heirloom passing not through bloodlines but through spiritual kinship. Chuck studied it carefully, turning the pages with gentle reverence, appreciating both the gesture and its meaning. He paused over a particular passage, underlined in faded ink. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he picked up his phone and, for the first time since the broadcast, made a call related to that evening. 6 months later, the most unexpected outcome of the Grace Table incident manifested in a joint project between Chuck Norris and T.D. Jakes. Not another television appearance, but a mentorship program for at-risk youth that combined Jakes's passionate advocacy with Norris's quiet discipline. The program focused not on creating celebrities or stars, but on building character through consistent practice and humble service. In a small gymnasium on Chicago's South Side, a dozen teenage boys watched as Chuck demonstrated a martial arts form, movements flowing with centered precision, each executed with focus and control. Nearby, Jakes observed, his usual commanding presence subdued into supportive attention. It's not about how hard you can hit, Chuck told the boys afterward. It's about how centered you remain when others are trying to knock you down. Jakes nodded, adding, and when you do fall, which all of us will, it's about getting back up with grace, not just with force. The two men exchanged a glance, a moment of silent understanding that reflected a partnership formed in the crucible of public humbling and private reconciliation. When asked by a reporter why they had chosen to collaborate, neither man mentioned the infamous broadcast directly. Sometimes, Chuck said simply, the most important connections come from unexpected moments. Jakes nodded in agreement, adding with a smile, and sometimes, the greatest strength is shown in how we respond when we fall. The reporter pressed for details about that night, asking if they believed there had been divine intervention in the chair's collapse. Jakes considered the question thoughtfully. I believe God speaks through circumstances, sometimes dramatically, sometimes subtly. What matters isn't the method, but whether we have the wisdom to listen. Chuck said nothing, but his slight smile spoke volumes. As the years passed, the moment remained in cultural memory, referenced in sermons, dissertations on media and spirituality, and discussions about authentic faith in a performance-driven world. What had begun as a ratings-driven confrontation between spiritual celebrities had somehow transcended its origins to become something more enduring. A living parable about pride, humility, and the quiet power of genuine faith. In a world increasingly defined by noise and spectacle, the lasting message emerged, not from thunderous declarations, but from a moment of unexpected silence. When one man fell, another helped him rise, and millions witnessed the simple, transformative power of grace in action. The final irony, perhaps, was that in a broadcast designed to generate controversy through conflict, the most powerful statement came not through words at all, but through their absence in the calm presence of a man who understood that true faith doesn't need to defend itself. It simply lives, quietly but consistently, ready to offer a steady hand when pride inevitably falls. Because some lessons don't need to be taught with words. They reveal themselves when the moment is right, and their message endures long after the cameras stop rolling. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.